At last, it's time for my last video on Ori's OST and in all likelihood my last video on Ori. To conclude this very long series, I'm finally going to take some time to study the various leitmotifs from Gareth Coker's score. As I had outlined in the video about Ori as a character, the final touch to the construction of the hero is to give them a theme, several thematic elements even, and the little spirit is such an omnipresent figure in the first game that those elements constantly bring us back to them. Nevertheless, after Ori and the Blind Forest, as their family grows and their adventure becomes even more personal, confronted with the loss of their sister, then a sacrifice to allow her and all of Nightwind's inhabitants to live, Ori's music will become even richer. Let's start, however, with the themes connected to the hero. The almost total absence of NPCs in Ori and the Blind Forest, except for Sane, means that most of the musical elements from the score tend to bring us back to the little spirits. Not everything is completely centered on them, but from the prologue we hear two themes that it would seem difficult not to associate with Ori, and a third, maybe more general one, in Swallow's Nest. There is first this theme accompanying the flight of the feather. Then the second one, already present in the menu, when Naru goes to see where the leaf landed. The first one is more active than the second one since the feather flies under the storm. It also makes us enter the story in a more gripping way. The rhythm is faster and the intervals are larger. We will of course find it very regularly in the work, from the introduction of the first dungeon, the Jinzu Tree, to the fanfares of Ori and the Will of the Wisps, and notably when they are near some of the ancestral trees. It can therefore be seen as the leitmotif of Ori's spirituality. But Ori, although they're a spirit, is raised with all the humanity and love of Naru, so they have a second theme which seems to be more related with their being a child, the child of Naru, the child of the spirit tree. It is based on a descending stepwise motion repeated several times, which gives it an immediately more plaintive character than the other theme, especially since when we hear it in the menu it is sung, doubled on the piano and the violin with a rather generous vibrato, very open sound, then on the flute. Just about everyone plays it, it is very intense, at least in this context. But above all, this theme is vocal. It is easy to sing, since it uses essentially a stepwise motion. It is moreover often sung, in Ori and the Blind Forest, a little as if it was Ori seen by someone else, their mother Naru or their father, the spirit tree. I mean that it's not Ori who expresses themselves. In Ori and the Blind Forest, we do not learn as much about Ori as they learn about Nibel and Kuro. This is not unreminiscent of the importance of narration. We saw that Ori's story was told in a very explicit way by the narrator, rather the narrators, Mora and Kwolok sometimes take over this role, and the choir, Voice of the Forest, in the second opus. However, its simplicity makes it a very versatile theme that can be heard quickly with more softness, in Swallow's Nest for example, or assurance in the escapes or the boss fights. It's all a matter of context. But it's not necessarily just Ori's theme, even if it is associated with them. We hear it, for example, near the spirit tree. Or notably at the beginning of the first cutscene in which Kuro appears, her rage, when the spirits are gathered and then Sane is removed from her tree. What's more, it's expressed with utmost intensity when Kuro sacrifices herself to save the forest, thus saving her last child, Ku. This would therefore be the theme of the parent-child bond. We know that the franchise multiplies and explores family figures, notably mother figures, that Ori has a double filiation, spiritual and human. The main theme of Ori's score illustrates the weight of this family motif. It's the leitmotif of the child, the leitmotif of the family bond. Finally, there is the theme that is heard when Ori and Naru are harvesting the fruits of Swallow's Nest's trees. as it is connected with the plenitude, almost the exhilaration of a happiness that nothing comes to disturb on that day. It could be considered to be the theme of childhood, such as it is lived by Ori, such as it was by Naru earlier. This theme appears briefly in the prologue of Ori and the Will of the Wisps, for instance, but it's mainly in the spirit caverns that it is heard, accompanying the little hero's return to life. In this zone, we even find the three main themes mixed together, as if to underline Ori's complete reconstruction after their strange resurrection. I show this in the video on musical loops. Other themes, motifs rather, can be found in the prologue of Ori and the Blind Forest. There's the motif of Ori's birth, often associated with moments of expectation and tension, positive or negative, tragic even, as when Ori returns with fruit to save Naru but is unaware of her condition, or when they succumb shortly afterwards. After the light ceremony, this other motif is repeated as Ori is coming back to life, then developed in the sunken glades. also in this score some less melodic elements, or rather transitional elements, that can yet be used for complete pieces, and there is one that I simply love, because the mostly rhythmic treatment of the themes illustrates the memorial function of the place. It's the second in-game music from Blackroot Burrows, dashed through their home. Indeed, Ori has a family, Naru, whose history and relation with the spirits they discover in the DLC that has them plunge into Blackroot Burrows. Most of the music uses the third theme from the prologue, that of the harvest, the leitmotif of childhood then, heard in all of the DLC's music, starting with the 3 cutscenes. This area is first explored in a quasi-darkness, lit up by the punctual light of the enemies and the flora of Nibel. The music, Through the Darkness, will use this theme of childhood, very slightly modified since we are in A minor, D major in the prologue, and whose rhythm, more in tension release than usual, lends itself well to the prudence that we must show in the zone. We are limited in our movements, seeing as in order to cross some obstacles or, on the contrary, materialize specific platforms, we have to carry an orb. But most importantly, after lifting the darkness that had fallen on the burrow, Ori gets the dash, backed by one of my favorite Ori and the Blind Forest tracks, Dash Through Their Home. While in the whole area, Ori was hindered by the presence of this orb, they can now explore the place where their mother spent her childhood, free of any constraint. To a cautious gameplay succeeds pure speed, in a place inhabited by the memory of Naru's family, and thus of Ori's. The use of the 5-4 allows here to combine this double discovery, that of the dash and that of Naru's youth, through very dynamic elements, especially in contrast with the music of the previous zone, and others which have more abandon, always through the musical prism of Ori. The first ostinato takes up an element often used in the introduction of certain pieces. Already cyclical in essence, it is made even more so here by the addition of a beat, but it is energized by rather brutal gestures, made of very fast stepwise motions or extremely rhythmic repeated notes on the strings. This very determined introduction, illustrating our newly acquired speed, leads to another opposite theme of great softness, of bliss, almost of beatitude, using again a rather introductory motif. It can be heard, for example, in Light of Nibel, entrusted essentially to the strings in a rather low register, which sounds here very soft, serene, with just the right amount of percussion, very discreet to keep the tension, and warmed by the clarinet. The initial ostinato comes back without strings, with some clear and precise percussion to support it, to lead to the return of the theme of Through the Darkness. The rhythm, slightly modified because of the time signature, makes it less organic, a little more jerky, which lends itself well to the growing tension due to the strings and the piano, very low, which come back as a rhythmic support. This rather rhythmic tension is followed by a melodic tension, this time in the winds, whose held notes overlap in a tiling effect, supported by the strings again, which will be resolved on another thematic element, which exploits the 5/4 time signature through its division. It is essentially in 3+2 with, as often, an acceleration at the end of the bar, which gives the feeling that the theme lingers a little on the first note of the bar, and in a zone of recollections I find that very relevant, even more when the division becomes 4+1, as if the note was completely abandoned, as if Ori immersed themselves in the memories of their mother before starting again with the last very dynamic section, dynamism reinforced, I think, by the distinctive sound of the open strings on the low G. The DLC is very well done musically because the last sub-area of Blackroot Burrows, more intimate, still takes up this theme of childhood in a warmer way, less dynamic from now on since Ori discovers Naru's relationship with her father, similar to their own relationship with Naru. We find the affection, the learning, then her father's death, as Ori experienced earlier with Naru. This does not prevent the music from the DLC to close with a reprise of the theme of spirituality by the entire orchestra, as a form of communion of Ori with Naru's past that they now know completely before ending gently. This is a very nice DLC that manages, despite the spectacular nature of the first ability we obtain, the dash, to keep a permanent link with the motion, dealing with the idea of memory from beginning to end, while discreetly keeping some traces of the merveilleux. The spirit light was also part of Naru's childhood. The way we look at these leitmotifs is therefore rather interesting, even relevant to our playable character. Although they are all connected to a facet of the hero, they link them to the other characters, and although Ori is obviously the central figure, at least in Ori and the Blind Forest, they show empathy and generosity, a generosity that is also musically evident as they lend their themes to the others. Both Kuro and the Spirit Tree use the main theme, for instance, and Naru is given pride of place in the DLC through the leitmotif of childhood. But now that Ori is not alone anymore in Nibble, a very strong relationship is formed between the hero and their sister. Then, by going in search of her, the encounters will multiply, and as a consequence, more themes will be heard. The first one is of course Ku's theme, played on the recorder or the whistle, and it is this theme that will be predominant in both the prologue and the beginning of the game. We feel Ku's distress, her wing that prevents her from flying, then the happiness as she is now finally able to fly close to the other birds in migration with Ori. In this scene, the two themes are mixed, but it is Ku's motif which is sung first. Ori accompanies her. The theme of the owl is here very full, it's a solo voice, not a choir, and is connected to Ori's theme to underline their fusional relationship. It is so beautiful to see Ku crossing Nibble, which she has not yet seen, as a sped-up childhood. Nibble was a metaphor for Ori's own fast-track childhood, and a way to share her siblings' adventures as Ori shows her Sane, then points the way straight ahead to Naiwen. The two characters are separated by the storm. Ku disappears from the screen, but not from the adventure. Let's go back to the opening of the game, the beginning of the gameplay. Ori, who's passed out, is approached by several monkeys, curious but shy, running away just as they hear a shrill cry. It's Shriek, the antagonist of the game, that we will really clearly see only later. The key is clearly set by a background in C# minor, a chord that spreads over the entire range of the orchestra, recalling the genre of the fantastic and the forest, from which Ku's theme rises, first on the piano, as Ori awakens. As if it were an impulse, a call not necessarily coming from Ori themselves, but which leads them to get up. They shout their sister's name, it's the only word we hear them pronounce during the whole adventure, in both games, looks for her in the distance, then sets off. Before the leitmotif of the little owl is taken up again, there is first a solo expressing for a moment the pain of the little spirit, in a surge of lyricism, a complaint that will change a little just after. The piano sets a pulse by a tonic arpeggio, which allows to signal the beginning of the gameplay. It is necessary to move forward because only one thing counts for Ori, saving their sister. As a cry, now aestheticized, integrated into the music, the theme of Phew is played on the English horn, the instrument of Ori. Given that the latter has grown up since the first adventure, it's not the oboe anymore, underlined by the low strings as sighs repress crying. There is thus a kind of mise en abîme between Phew, who is an emotional reference point for Ori, and Ori themselves, who becomes an emotional reference point for the Mokies. As I had suggested in one of the videos, by acquiring their first weapon, a simple flame, Ori is portrayed as a guardian, a protector, for Phew, for the Mokies, and finally for the whole forest. Moreover, this lyrical moment is immediately enlightened. It is recurrent in Ori, nothing is ever completely dark, hope always comes back to illuminate the apparently most desperate situations by a more suspended moment. Ori makes a first meeting, the forest is not deserted, someone will be able to help them. To assert this position as a guardian, Ori gets the Spirit Blade, in a scene I already analyzed in my first video. After the confrontation with Howl, we land in his now silent lair. Discreetly attracted by a Moki, we face the first ancestral tree in our new adventure. To the danger of the wolf, its spectacular orchestra sweeping all the possible spectrum of the frequencies, its specific percussion, succeed, it's the return of the merveilleux, the enchantment of the storm illuminated by the ancestral light and the softness of the harp, then the liberation of the spirit voice of the tree's power. Taking up the harp motif, the solo cello develops Naru and Gumo's complaint. We find this opening of the sound, thanks to the vibrato again. But the vision of the birds migrating towards Naiwen gives a purpose to the two parents. As often, the pulse comes back, more assertive, the harmony is brighter. We know all this, I had already talked about it. So let's get back to Phew. After Ori's acquiring their new weapon, Phew's theme will return, played with more and more instruments. First a cello solo, still quite dark, anticipating in a way what will happen in the silent woods or illustrating Ori's despair gradually leaving them, then a duet, English horn and flute. Although it reuses the string effects from the beginning, the size in a way, Ori is no longer alone. The monkeys will help them, they have a new objective, Kwolok. A little as if Ori's sadness calmed down little by little through contact with the monkeys and the hope they embody in their quest, but Ori embodies in return a hope for them. The musical elements from the opening scene, Under the Storm, become softer, brighter, in contact with the musical elements from the monkeys, the musical elements of hope. This softens even more in the following music. Indeed, we no longer here now use the light we want to see in Inkwater Marsh, but a shine upon Inkwater Marsh, more soothing, somehow celebrating the beauty of the forest. Whose theme disappears for a few moments in favor of something else, including the return of the theme of spirituality, well, at least that's how I call it, giving way to the generosity and depth of the strings so beautiful in this piece. Yet we find again this idea of the piano that led Ori at the very beginning of the gameplay, the first iteration of Ku's leitmotif, which seemed to bring Ori out of their torpor. We finally find it in the dungeon at the end of the puzzle with the big rotating wheel, amelioration. Starting the mill again means accessing the Silent Woods, where Ku is lost. Finally, Ori finds Ku. After a shy but desperate flute call to which Ori answers, calling their sister, a leitmotif is stated with a lot of warmth on the strings, with the choir in an affectionate support, witnessing a moving scene contrasting with the desolation of the Silent Woods. Only to be interrupted by Shriek's descending motif, condemning them. Sooner or later they will have to fight her. It's something that was emphasized by the looks. Ori did not take their eyes off Shriek. It's not enough to sweep away the happiness of the two siblings, and the theme of the menu returns, announcing the wish of a return to their home, to Swallow's Nest. Ori and Ku express themselves in turn through their favorite instrument, the English horn, then the flute, taking again a thematic element of the first game. Its rather slow rhythm allows it to adapt to the scene, to the comfort of both siblings. But in order for them to go back home, it's necessary to cross Shriek's territory, a land of ashes and bones. This sequence turns rather quickly into a game of hide and seek, with the one of whom these woods are the domain. Shriek is never far, and it's quite naturally that, like a threat, haunting this disturbing place, her theme will join Ori and Ku's musical elements in a strange and fatal trio. Ori's elements are more in support in the background, while the strings have Ku's theme, then Shriek as a soloist. The piano adds a thematic element of Ori, then another one as a transition, before the return of Kw's theme, always haunted by shrieks. The emphasis on the two owls reminds us that we are in the woods where all of them have perished because of the decay. By the way, Kw's and Shriek's themes begin with the same notes, but I will come back to Shriek's theme later. During all this sequence, we don't hear Ori at all. Since it is Kwu who is in charge of the movements, Ori doesn't jump. All of the very cheerful sound design, typical of their movements, disappears, suppressing the last trace of light and vivacity in these places. But this confusing game of hide-and-seek ends with a confrontation between the two owls, Ori being quickly removed from the equation, during which Kwu doesn't hide anymore and confronts Shriek with her modest abilities. Sorry Kwu, but the fight's not really fair, while the orchestra and the choir give in to fright. After finding Kwu, Ori will be confronted, as in the first opus, with a mission: explore the forest to find the Wisps. Kw's leitmotif will disappear to give way to other themes, some associated with characters or places they inhabit, particularly Mora and Boar, in addition to another theme already heard in the prologue and the Silent Woods, material that serves as the base for the magnificent music of Llama Pools and the Windswept Wastes. But Kw's theme will return in 2 short scenes. Time is running out. Among the new characters accompanying the little spirit in their quest, there's of course Kwolok. He clearly has a theme and an instrument, the clarinet, the bass clarinet most of the time. The clarinet arrives a little before we get to the entrance of Kwolok's Hollow, when we meet Arthur in front of the mill and Shriek interrupts our conversation. It's a nice transition before the entrance of Kwolok's bass clarinets, in addition to accompanying the very woody area. The tone of the clarinet lends itself well to this. Another sound is revealed, which will accompany us in all this part of the Kwolok-centered act until the mill, the wellspring. Some percussion, very dry, close to the kodama from Princess Mononoke. The Toad does not present himself to us at once, which is going to emphasize another point of view. The music is not going to be treated from the point of view of Ori, a hero discovering Niwen, anymore, but well and truly from this mysterious Kwolok's point of view. When approaching the Toad statue, the Mokis recall that Kwolok saw Ku in the Silent Woods. The alto flute introduces one of the main themes of Ori and the Will of the Wisps, already heard briefly in the prologue and recurring in Lamapools or the Windswept Wastes, here made particularly mysterious by the major thirds and the contrast between the flute's lack of attack and the attacks and sound of these thirds. This part will be repeated in one of the saddest and musically fantastic moments of the adventure, precisely in the Silent Woods. The Mokis are often themselves guardians of the forest's infrastructures and responding to Kwolok's instructions. Let us go and see the statue as Kwolok's theme is finally stated. Percussion, flute and bass clarinet fill the space before the orchestra also takes up Kwolok's theme as we head for the bow. Kwolok is still quite mysterious, challenging us. We must be worthy of him according to the legend. It won't be the last time. This challenge becomes more concrete with the acquisition of the new weapon. After a short introduction, allowing us to focus on the new mechanics, the bow, a theme comes back. It's a variation on one of the main themes heard just before in Ku's cutscene. highlighting again by the luminous instrumentation, we thank the very open sound of the flute just after, this idea of Ori's growing hope as information comes to them about the owl. Opening the statue is one step towards finding their sister. The theme that illustrated Ku's distress as she was lost accompanies Ori's drive to find her a few moments later. Gareth Coker's thematic work in this score is truly exemplary. The statue opens its mouth, the choir sings Kwolok's name, Sweden offers us their merchandise, and here we are in Kwolok's Hollow. And there the music settles down a little, Kwolok too probably, in front of Ori's adventures, and it is with a certain humor that the theme is going to develop, always with a bass clarinet. The introduction states extremely clearly the percussion ostinato. It's not improvised, it's on the contrary very tight. It also settles the key, B minor, which will accompany us for a while until we see Kwolok in the flesh. The reverb and the echo also tells us that this solo is big, very big. This percussion motif provides a perfect base for the bass clarinet to unfold its solo. The two parts of the theme are reversed to start with the more active motif. The woodwinds enter the challenge to comment, with marimba interventions that fade into the background, it seems to me, accompanying the solo piano, before a rather suspended moment focused solely on the percussion, whose treatment is fascinating in the whole Kwolok-centered part of the adventure, to announce the return of the initial elements, but with a counterpoint this time. The bass clarinet solo is now accompanied by the orchestra that dresses it with a kind of languor quite magical. Then the second element, the woodwinds interventions, more rhythmic, have the counterpoint on the percussion reinforced before the theme initially played on the piano is, this time, taken up with the strings. The total absence of rubato gives a lot of humor to the half tone A-sharp B, and then the major second C-sharp B with the glissando as a bonus. We can't dawdle, we must find Kwolok. I find this is a fun contrast to the very classical sound of the strings at that moment. The excellent sound design offers a nice counterpoint too with the music. The bass clarinet's tone has some fat to it and emphasizes the intervals of the melody, while the level design of Kwolok's cave focuses on the bow, with a sound design made of much shorter and higher-pitched elements, which themselves contrast with the low sound of the Kwolok platforms. At the very bottom of the cave, there's a new ability, the dash, and this is where the mix between narration and gameplay will be done. Although we still have one more skill to obtain before meeting Mr. Toad, the dash is a new step in our movements. The bow made platforms appear, the dash offers a form of autonomy. We no longer need those Kwolok-shaped platforms to evolve, and we will be able to get closer to him. Dashing and bashing starts in a very dynamic way, that's logical, with an asymmetry. It's 3 plus 5, sometimes even 3 plus 3 plus 2, which I find very adapted to the liveliness of the platforming. I like to think of it as a sonic illustration of the rhythm of the platforming, with the stops of the bash, the bounce of the double or triple jump. The theme of spirituality, as I suggested before, is stated with the same carelessness. I often say that the forest is a playground for Ori and the music accompanies the liveliness of the gameplay. But to keep a connection with Kwolok, since we are still proving ourselves worthy of Mr. Toad, his theme returns with a discreet but very rhythmic ostinato, offering a nice contrast with the melodic character of the clarinet. It's a short moment of transition which leads to the return of the theme that we heard a short time before, on the flute, when we saw Ku in the Silent Woods, this theme from the prologue which will accompany us in several zones. There, it is slightly varied to make it more open. There is always this thread of Ori's hope. The theme is more tender, anticipating the reunion with Ku. The oboe merges with the strings in a luminous communion. We find the same piano scales as in the scene where Ori obtained the Spirit Blade to conclude this part. All the first part of the game is a return of the hope to see Ku again. The thematic elements of Kwolok's Hollow come back to ensure the unity of this long sequence. We are indeed still there. The percussion ostinato returns with this specific sound associated with Kwolok, the woodwind's intervention, then the strings and their amusing glissando to finish more discreetly in order to allow the loop to work. Only the percussion and the clarinet remain. After obtaining the dash, we have to face Hornbug and get the bash, my precious. The toad isn't the most accommodating guy. Hornbug has its music, the key stays the same for consistency, then the dash music loops again before arriving in Kwolok's throne room. When we finally meet the one who has been challenging us for several dozens of minutes, it's in a much more majestic and impressive way. Although he's the one behind this long challenge, he's an auxiliary, a helper for the Marquis who seem to depend on him and are very attached to the toad, a master and a guide for us as well. When he gives us the voice of the forest, a motif from Ori and the Blind Forest can be heard, several motifs, even one generally used as an introduction, the other associated with Ori's spirituality, the first theme of the prologue, that of the leaf. We find this idea of a mirror between the guardians, the emotional reference points. Here the presence of a spirit, of the light, that Ori is, wakes up the forest, wakes up its voice, and the presence of Kwolok wakes up Ori because he brings them closer to Ku, their only objective for the moment. Thereafter, Kwolok is a guiding thread, an important presence for the forest and our quest, but that we ultimately meet less than Lupo, for instance. However, his throne room will be adorned with darker and more muted colors when Ku rests after her attack. It will also be a place of recollection after Kwolok's death. After the introductory music, the toad's theme discreetly haunts the area, either sung mouth closed by the choir, as always illuminated by percussion, so that Ku's sleep doesn't sound too fatal, Kwolok's soul is watching over her, or in a more open way as the orchestra and the choir unite, keeping however a form of warmth in this solemn but still welcoming place. Moreover, after the first meeting with Kwolok, it's no longer dashing and bashing that we hear in the zone preceding the throne room, that would be too intense, but a transitional music, always in B. The Wellspring Glades will finally bring another key, G major. It's a safe place, completely apart, it has a key of its own. Facing Naiwen's decline and seeing the distress of Ori, Kwolok decides to help us look for the Wisps. We find him in lumber pools. There, he unfortunately faces the Fall Presence. The toad is found in a puppet state, poor marionette manipulated by the Fall Presence, and that we must hit to recover the strength of the forest. After the monkeys warn us that something's wrong with the toad, Kwolok's theme is accompanied by two chords. Through the voice leading, we oscillate between F minor and B major like a two-faced effect. It is indeed Kwolok who's in front of us, but not the same Kwolok. The choir gives a certain opening on the D, in particular the B-flat major chord, that Kwolok's theme on the low strings comes to completely stifle. It accentuates the tonic of the first chord, so it locks us in F minor. Before slowly the corruption is revealed. Kwolok's theme is stated again, but it segues into a section that, I find, conveys the dread that Ori, the monkeys and Kwolok himself may feel, though Ori doesn't seem all that disturbed by shifting to the high register and the trills of the violins and the flute, it seems to me, for a spectacular effect. As I said in my very first video on Ori, there is in the fights this paradoxical character that the classic fights are rather seen under a very positive light. Ori frees the forest from creatures which do not seem to belong to it, or at least are too little anthropomorphized for us to feel any empathy towards them. Hence the generally positive music of the fight tutorial in Ori and the Blind Forest, and the whole staging of our acquiring the Spirit Blade in Ori and the Will of the Wisps. On the other hand, the boss fights don't show the slightest trace of humor, and the fight against Kwolok is even less of an exception, since we are dealing with a guide for the monkeys for the forest and a source of hope for Ori in search of their sister. There are two loops, one for the escape and one for the fight itself. The music of the escape keeps playing on the spectacular side. It's massive too, because it's a rather slow escape. Kwolok is manipulated by the Fall Presence. We will see the difference with Mora, possessed by corruption, and who moves frantically from one end of her arena to the other, spraying us with boiling acid. He was never treated this way. Kwolok was for us a mysterious figure, a master that Ori had to prove themselves worthy of, and who seemed to be watching us from his throne room, then a benevolent figure. The orchestra and the choir are used to their fullest extent, and the composer takes advantage of the beginning of the leitmotif, an arpeggio, to transform it rhythmically to the point of obsession. It's very close to Prokofiev's Dance of the Nights. The sound and the articulation are very intense, to the point of keeping almost only one interval, an ascending octave, reducing Kwolok to his simplest expression, while the choir continues to chant his name again and again. When the actual fight begins, after a short transition, Ori's theme finally comes back with lyricism. The hero is fighting their friend. It's more than a mere reminiscence of Ori. The theme is stated again one octave higher, and the evolution of the counterpoint of the choir brings us back, as often, to the warmth, here very strange, paradoxical, of Ori's score. As a symbol of the cruelty of this strange fight, the elements associated with Kwolok come to interrupt this moment, reminding us that whatever the nature of their relationship was, Ori has to hit the puppet toad. Everything is very hard, the choir that chants Kwolok like blows, accompanied by the crescendos in the brass, the rhythmic of the latter, then the small haunting cells in the winds, on a minor third, mirrored in a more spectacular way in the strings that will go from high to low, sweeping the entire range of the instruments. Everything plays on the extremes, the contrary motions, and the accumulation of references to Kwolok by the choir, which chants his name tirelessly up to the point that it sounds frightening, by the omnipresence of his leitmotif, at least of the initial arpeggio, gives the impression that the forest cries out the pain of Kwolok. The tension falls a little with a small moment of transition where the theme is played with low strings, but the percussion keep the intensity. After the last blow, the brass close the fight on the tonic, completely crushed as the strings use the whole range of their instrument in trills of fright. Kwolok ultimately manages to kill the Fall Presence and to bid farewell to Ori. The theme returns to the clarinet, partially, only the initial arpeggio, the expression of the last forces of the Moki's guide, whereas he entrusts them, as well as the whole forest, to the small spirits. The warmth, obviously tinged with a deep sadness, of the strings and the choir come back one last time to sing Kwolok's theme, taken up by the piano, while the strings and the choir gradually fade away. The theme seems to slowly dissolve as well. Kwolok's soul is no longer held back by anything but the memory of the Mokis and the little spirits. The fight with Mora is quite different. We don't know her presence being limited to Marlwood depths, in particular her nest. We will only see her there. We have no attachment to her. She responds to our invasion of her nest and our light, which is not welcome. Ori is not compelled to attack a friend. They respond to an attack during which they must gain the upper hand. It's a different atmosphere within the one area from Naiwen in which the fantastic tone is most expressed. There was a video about this, and it's a different pace. Whereas Kwolok is passive, an unfortunate puppet of the Fall Presence, Mora is directly possessed by the corruption and, coupled with the usual spider imagery, will give in to a kind of frenzy. She has a pattern similar to Kwolok's. She throws several projectiles in quick succession that can be bashed back at her, but this one is much faster. Rather than focusing on the opposition between the lyricism, recalling the link between Kwolok and Ori, and the fear of a relentless fight against the guide of the forest, here the music will underline the frenzy of Mora in her nest, with the fantastic tone and Ori's taking control of this confrontation. The very particular atmosphere of Marlwood depths, studied in the video on genres, tones rather, is followed by the silence of Mora's nest, suddenly disturbed by PIDs, even tapping on the strings more than PIDs. It sounds less concrete, as the spider slowly reveals herself behind us. A frightened cry from the choir accompanies our fall, and here we go. Mora's frenzy is not translated by an unpredictable rhythm, on the contrary, to really highlight the spectacular elements of the music in the treatment of the theme, the same as for Mildwood Depths. The bass is almost imperturbable, and we often find a controlled, systematic element to emphasize what is not or less controlled. The rhythm of the introduction is thus unperturbed, in 16th note sextuplets, I suppose, arpeggios going back and forth incessantly, tirelessly, with a slight emphasis on their movement. The phrasing and dynamics both accompany the movement of the arpeggios. They are not at all emphasized as in Kwolok's boss fight theme. They were part of his leitmotif and were therefore treated with intensity, not here. A harp glissando leads us to the other thematic elements, notably a long descending motion highlighting chromaticisms, repeated in stages, getting louder, illustrating Mora's curse maybe, and the very specific sound of the percussion, which will finally remain quite soft during the fight. The theme of the depths, which was treated with a form of sonic purity by the violin in the high register and through the systematic, ineluctable descending motion, illustrating fragility in contrast with the darkness that engulfed us and wished to engulf the music as well in a way to corrupt it, is here treated rhythmically in a relentless way, logically very tight. It's Mora who attacks us, then taken up again with more intensity, one octave higher, and with the strings and the choir in accentuation. The strings in particular doubling the long notes with trills. This is the first step in the comic frenzy of rage of the spider, but it is not yet frantic because there's the rhythm of the bass, always unperturbed, and which leaves a little room to breathe, and especially at the end of the phrase, this fast and rather light G minor arpeggio systematically returning, contrasting with the progressive excess in the treatment of the theme, thus underlining this excess and maintaining a sort of frame for the moment. Besides, in this part, the horns are not present. They were much louder just before in the short transition, almost crushed, but not anymore. It must also be said that Mora's sound design is at least vigorous, if not deafening. The music must also remain within a certain limit. The next section, however, begins to emphasize Mora's frenzy, with the ostinato of the high strings contrasting with the depth of Mildwood's leitmotif in the low strings. Everything is repeated, but everything is amplified, everything is more. But not too much. Again, before completely sinking, we move on to something else, another ostinato, less frenetic, still in the strings, while the choir seems to chant Mora's name. The winds are unperturbed in 8th notes. There is always a frame, a limit which is never crossed. As the music always plays on repetition and amplification, it is taken up again and amplified, the trills in particular are back. But does the music lose control? Not completely, although what comes next is not very reassuring with those infernal glissandos. I certainly see in it a metaphor of the thread at the end of which the spider hangs, which goes down and then up again, but also the corruption to which Mora gives in, a sort of point of no return. The last rise in power approaches before the escape, the arpeggios accelerate, it's more gripping, almost chaotic from now on, with still the trills and now the sudden crescendos in the brass. A last blow and we move on to the second phase. Mora surrenders herself entirely to her corruption and destroys the lower part of the arena to chase us until we get to the upper part, where one of the wisps is imprisoned, the Eyes of the Forest, a moment obviously very rhythmic. To prepare us for the next part, rather focused on Ori's takeover, the beginning of Ori's theme, the main theme, is repeated. To this descending movement, here nagging, because it comes back again and again, is opposed Mora's infinite chromaticism, ascending, stretching over an octave and then resuming, obsessive, so that the whole thing culminates on an ascending motion, completely interrupted by a new key and the return of Ori's theme. From now on, it's the little spirit who calls the dance. It's one of the secondary elements often used in introduction, sung by the choir. It's a support, there is no more fear, no fright, it is soft but asserted, and especially treated in 16th notes on the strings, and there, too, it is determined but a bit more frenetic. It is Ori who asserts themselves against Mora, whose theme certainly returns, but as if Ori was calling out to them, "I am stronger than you," their theme returning with an extreme lyricism, emerging from the savagery of the fight. The whole orchestra now seems to be on Ori's side, the epic character of this moment being even amplified by Mora's shriek when she calls the darkness. The loop is long enough for the fight to go on without repetition, but there still has to be a loop. It ends with a return to Mora's chromaticism, that of the escape, calmer, in a sort of liquidation of the thematic elements, perhaps a little too calm precisely as the beginning of the loop is powerful with the return of Ori. But again, as very often in Ori and the Will of the Wisps, it's long enough so that we cannot hear it twice and the fight can end before. Finally freed from corruption, Mora can offer us the eyes of the forest and be joined by her children. The oboe allows the theme of the area to have another phrasing. The tragedy is lifted, then the instrumentation accompanies this touching scene where one of Mora's children squeezes up against her. As the area has been deeply changed, the darkness is lifted, the obscurity no longer engulfs us, the loop of Marlwood depths also becomes lighter, brighter. For all that, we have not put an end to the forest's decline. Let's finish with the antagonist of Ori and the Will of the Wisps, Shriek. She is also an owl. Her theme starts like coos, it's slightly different rhythmically, but it is completely descending. In most cases, the motif is stated twice, starting on the tonic and then a fifth below, ending on the tonic. It is kind of closed on itself, which is not surprising. Shriek was born after the death of her parents because of the decline that left the silent woods in ashes, a place without roundness, brittle. She could not escape. Shriek did not trigger the decay, yet she is strongly connected to it. She is, apparently, the only living being born during said decline, and therefore bears its traces. Some characters succumb to it, the Moki's family and the Moki himself, but only Shriek suffers its consequences. The other owls outside the woods are not affected. She defends her woods, reigns over them, but appears in other areas of Naiwen, logically enough so that we meet her several times before entering her domain, threatening their inhabitants. If she prevents success to Widow's End, she is not the cause of the corruption that invades it. However, her theme also invades the music of Widow's End. Would she only be presented as a child of decay? Is it chosen because she is the ultimate threat hanging over Ori after this dungeon? One suspects that the confrontation is inevitable. The way Ori stares at her during their reunion with Ku leaves little doubt about the certainty that they will fight her at some point. For the fight against Shriek, there is no surprise. We were expecting something spectacular, we have it. The very dynamic motif of the ascending scale, which followed us back from the Jinzo tree in the first opus, opens the confrontation, but very quickly, Shriek's theme will literally impose itself. It is, however, changed compared to the rest of the score. It's a bit like in the music of The Last Escape of Ori and the Blind Forest, fleeing Kuro. The motif is first stated normally, and the second time, instead of resuming a descending motion 1/5 lower, it is altered in favor of a much more dynamic ascending motion. For Kuro, we had this. For Shriek, it's a similar thing, but even more. It better translates the force of the confrontation by giving it momentum. It's the last opportunity for Shriek to show the extent of her power and finally get rid of the light of the small spirits. From another point of view, that of the forest, that of Ori, this ascending motion can underline, as it often did, the fear. This motif will be repeated again and again. All the rhythms, all the octaves, all the techniques are used. We find in fact what I had mentioned for Ku in the prologue or for Kwolok in the boss fight, the omnipresence of Shriek's leitmotif, then of the elements associated with Ori, concentrates the confrontation. Shriek attacks Ori, Ori confronts Shriek, reduces it to a bare minimum, and most of all, if you are receptive to the score's various leitmotifs, it can sound like a reaffirmation of Shriek as an antagonist, certainly, but especially as a character. Of course, the design of Shriek as an adult is extremely spectacular. The confrontation is just as spectacular. It's even downright chaotic. I still have trouble reading it. It's what we expected, and the music doesn't disappoint either. But Shriek is one of those lonely antagonists rejected at a young age, not by everyone, but by adults, unfortunately, so she lived alone her whole life. Like a radiant, forgotten by her creations, triggering an infection to remind them of her, but the musical treatment was very different in the fight against the Radiants. Here we can hear a reaffirmation of her identity, which is very painful. That's her tragedy. Deep down, Shriek knows only herself. In this fight, she finally has someone to listen to her name, a name that musically takes up all the space, all the sonic space. The idea is actually more similar to that of the battle against the Hollow Knight. In that case too, the beginning of the leitmotif is repeated obsessively, reminding us that the vessel chosen by the king had been limited to one thing only, their function. In Shriek's case, the leitmotif is treated in multiple ways, giving a far more chaotic result. Although she's not humanized until the very end of the game, and when she's a kid, Shriek is nevertheless more humanized than the adult Hollow Knight. Like for the fight against Mora, Ori's theme arrives defiantly just after the escape sequence. Ori is a franchise about family. Its imagery is full of mother figures, notably, and family relationships. Shriek never knew her parents, forever frozen in those ashen woods, but their eerie carcasses are still there. The owl will look for their tragic embrace, an impossible embrace, and try a return, alas impossible as well, to childhood. Her leitmotif is adorned with the sweetness of childhood, with a simplicity that is new to her, but it's too late for her to be saved. Obviously, the work will close on the elements which had opened it in the prologue of Ori and the Blind Forest, with a calmer color. Hope is always there, but there's no need anymore for this instability of the tension due to this first disturbance, this imbalance. A form of certainty surrounds us, envelops us from now on. Mirroring the scene of Ori's death, the epilogue opens on the warmth of the choir. In the prologue, Ori succumbed on a very pared-down music, with solo piano, then violins and strings. The merveilleux is there associated with the spirit light, thanks to the loop that will be warmed by 3 phrases sung by the choir. The appearance and disappearance of memories also reminds us of the breathing, the organic character of this light, of this story. In a last impulse, Ku's theme is stated one last time. The strings are colored by the flute. Ori indeed sacrifices themselves without even saying her one last time. One of their themes then resounds. As Ku reaches the place where Ori sacrificed themselves, we hear one of the motifs from the prologue, the harvest or childhood motif. As always, the pulse comes back when hope is reborn. It's the same music as during Ori's resurrection, one tone higher, the same instrumentation, we find the oboe of the little spirit, but it does not lead to anything spectacular. Nature here runs its course, Ori Shriek grows, and it is thus in a more organic way that the texture of the orchestra is enriched. The piano announces the almost perfect symmetry of the work by the return of the initial motif, the small dactyl whose tranquility was then disturbed by a more tense orchestra. This is not the case here, and it's of course the voice that concludes the cycle with ever more warmth. After all, Ori becomes father or mother in their turn. Well, it's official, this analysis of Ori soundtrack is over. If you've been patient enough to watch all of this, a huge thanks to you. It was extremely long, but I hope you enjoyed it, or at least a few minutes of this never-ending rambling. Now this is the end. This was the last video on Ori as well. I don't really see what I could add about the franchise. I don't think there's anything that needs an additional video. I think I've been pretty chatty on the subject. What to do after that? Well, I'd like to start doing shorter videos, sometimes for games that wouldn't require extended analysis, or focus on specific scenes from games, and I'd like to try it with Dawnkeeper. I find it very interesting, but I don't think I would need a very long video to talk about it, as well as Chants of Sennaar, Jusant, then probably Spiritfarer. There's also Celeste and Little Nightmares 2 that are on the to-do list, as well as Metroid Dread and Metroid Prime, but for Metroid I should take the time and listen to the previous soundtracks, at least. But the two next videos will be Chants of Sennaar and Dawnkeeper, with Little Nightmares 2 after that. Okay, thanks again, and goodbye.